And hello everyone, my name is Daniel Frierson, and it's been a little bit delayed, but it's finally time to talk about this budget gaming PC setup that I have been putting together in the background. And yes, I said setup. No longer are we aiming for a budget, but still quite powerful gaming PC. We want the full gaming PC setup. Monitor, keyboard, mouse, controller, PS4. Talk about that later. So without further ado, why don't we actually have a look at the parts on the desk in front of me. Now, a few of these are actually quite interesting. The first being that this all started when I found an eBay listing for a job lot of PC parts with no bids on it roughly 3 weeks ago. And I bid appropriate for the parts that were involved in this auction at around £9.98. And the auction went for 99p. No one else bid. I got it for the starting bid. I got it for £1.11 all in. That was the cost of the initial components. And what was in that box? A full ATX 1155 motherboard with a 2500K. An i5 2500K, an overclockable i5 for £1. It didn't even matter that it came with a HD 6850, or the 8 gigs of RAM, or the DVD drive, the cooler, or anything else. The motherboard and CPU alone were worth what I initially bid, and I got them for £1.11 all in. Bit of an interesting trip getting them though, because my mother trusted her sat-nav a bit too much and we ended up in London. Okay, but let's go into the rest of it. Obviously, a CPU and motherboard combo like that, that's a really good platform to start building the rest of a PC around. And that's what I did. And the first thing that I needed to upgrade over this initial setup was the RAM. 8 gigs of RAM in 2025 isn't just enough anymore, it's the bare minimum. Realistically, programs and games want 16 gigs as a minimum, and I would highly recommend, if you're building a new PC in 2025 or 2026 as we go into it, that you look into 32 gigs of RAM going forwards. I've seen it personally that my gaming PC with 32 gigs of RAM commonly uses at least 24 when I load up a modern game. That's just the state of gaming. We need more RAM, both GPU-wise and platform-wise. But, obviously, as I said, 8 gigs of RAM is what this bundle came with, and that wasn't enough. Thankfully, looking at eBay in the auction section again, I was able to find a kit of 8 gigs of RAM that matched the existing kit in this system. So I jumped on that and purchased it at a cost of £5.36. Yeah, I bought 8 gigs of DDR3 1600 for £5.36. That's a tiny bit over what you would expect to pay for 8 gigs of DDR3. Realistically, you'd be expected to pay about 4. Now, as for the SSD and the hard drive I got for free out of an old Sky Q box that I found on a local Freegal site. I took the hard drive out of it, formatted it, and now I have a 1TB hard drive. The SSD we'll be using as our boot drive is a 120GB Patriot Burst with no DRAM cache, unfortunately. But it is still a pretty decent SSD, and I already had it on hand from a viewer several months ago who donated it to the channel. Thank you very much for that again. But I've costed this in at around £8, because that's appropriate for what a 120GB SSD is roughly worth. And that wasn't the only part I had to chip in personally. I had a bit of difficulty locating a power supply for this setup. You see, people seem to know what power supplies are worth now, and it's been a bit difficult to find a low-end cheap power supply that would have been able to power all of this reliably. Thankfully, I already had one on hand, and I was able to use past eBay auction pricing to estimate its value at roughly £8. And here's the power supply in question, a 450-watt Super Flower that I got in an eBay auction that actually had a full featured video on the channel quite a while ago. But this is a reliable and fully working power supply, and as I said, it's worth roughly £8. So that's what I've accounted it for in the budget. Now, the TV was free. I got that off of Facebook Marketplace of all places. Yeah, you don't expect to find anything decent in the free section on Facebook Marketplace, and you don't often actually get anything at all when you try and message someone for a free item on Facebook Marketplace. Facebook Marketplace is renowned for people messing you around and wasting your time. But it's a 32-inch LG TV, it's 1080p, and it works. So that's all it needed to do. The fact that it works is good enough for me. We're aiming for 1080p performance here, and we needed a 1080p display in order to do that. Now obviously, so far the only GPU I've mentioned is this HD 6850 that came with the initial box of components. The box of components that started this whole mess. On the extreme budget end, if you wanted to make this a £20 gaming setup, you could forego the GPU upgrade that I have included in all of this, and you could use this 6850 for 720p gaming, and provided it was anything older than 2016 that you wanted to play, because this isn't going to be playing modern titles even at 720p. It's a decent GPU, granted, it roughly matches a PS4. I have one right here, but that isn't capable of modern games. Same way a PS4 isn't capable of modern games. Anyway, so I have included a GPU upgrade. I actually made a bit of a discovery one night while I was on eBay. There was a listing for an NVIDIA GPU, and it was an auction listing as well. Now, there were no indications in the description or on the actual GPU in the pictures to tell me what GPU I was about to bid on. The description said that the owner thought it was a GTX 1050, maybe a 1050 Ti, which I imagine is why the majority of the bids were around 1050 pricing. But it turns out what we were all bidding on was actually a 3GB GTX 1060. This one right here. It's an MSI bog standard low spec 3GB GTX 1060. In fully working condition, purchased for £18.46, which is roughly half what a 3GB 1060 goes for. Which means that this isn't just a budget gaming system, it's a pretty high performing budget gaming system. We have a quad-core overclockable i5 2500K, 16 gigs of DDR3 1600, a GTX 1063GB, a boot SSD, a 1TB hard drive, Windows 11. This is, for all intents and purposes, a fairly competent gaming setup. And we haven't even gotten into the good parts yet. Yeah, a 1060 for less than 20 British pounds is exciting, considering the last time I paid for one of these, it was over 140 British pounds. So let's talk about these bulky components. Yeah, okay, you've probably noticed there's a keyboard on the desk, there's a mouse in this pile of crap. Those were free. Those are very old Dell OEM products. They are very, very unbearable to use. I'm sorry, but this membrane keyboard here, this keyboard feels like I am typing on a sponge. It's awful. I hate it. But it works. It's also a PS2 keyboard. You remember PS2? The standard of connector that IBM started in the 80s? Yeah, it's a PS2 keyboard. So this probably got included with Dell computers that still ran Windows XP. That's how old this is. And this mouse while it is USB, while it is a laser mouse, the tracking on it is awful, and for any game where you want to use a mouse, it's actually more enjoyable to use a controller. Now, on the topic of controllers, there is this PS4. This PS4 I picked up off of Facebook Marketplace about a year ago now, and the issue it was having, and the issue that it is still having, is that it has a dead hard drive, or at least a dying hard drive. Every 4 or 5 restarts you can get this thing to boot, but the hard drive in this thing is bad. Now, obviously, we do not have the budget for another hard drive, so we won't be able to revive this PS4 and include it in this gaming setup. But the only interesting thing about this PS4 is I still have a controller for it. So this PS4 was free, and this controller was included. This controller is very dinged up, it doesn't hold a charge for very long anymore, but it is a controller. So, for all intents and purposes, this is the controller that is included in this bundle, this system. However, I am not a big fan of the PS4 DualShock controller. I much prefer the PS5 DualSense controller, and I very, very much prefer Xbox controllers. So, for all of my gameplay testing today, I will be using an Xbox One S controller, but I'm not including that in the budget because these things still go for about £30 British, which almost doubles everything that I've spent so far. So for budgeting purposes, let's just pretend that I'm using this controller when I'm playing games, and not this one. Anyway, yes, the only thing I need to revive this PS4 is to put like a 1TB SSD in here, or a 1TB hard drive, and then it's fine. This PS4 does work. I used it for a few months before I bought a PS5. So, I know it works, it just has a very flaky hard drive. Realistically, you could sacrifice the 1TB of game storage for the PC and put that hard drive in here. That's an option. Or you could just sell on the PS4, because a dead hard drive PS4 is worth about £25 British, and maybe buy yourself a better CPU. The i5-3570K is only an £8 British CPU used. And since we won't be using it, if you went out and sold this HD 6850, which is worth about £3 British. So if you went out and sold the PS4 and used some of that money to upgrade the CPU, you would net yourself £17 off of the total cost. So that brings the total cost back down to about £25 British. But then if you sold the HD 6850 for a further £3, the total cost of this entire thing is £22 British. If you just sold the PS4 and this HD 6850, it goes down to £22 British all in. Now, I won't be selling them, but because these things are spare and because they have value, let's pretend that we can. So, this is technically a £40 and 91 pence gaming setup, or let's just say £41 British, or it's a £22 British gaming setup. Your choice. Anyway, elephant in the room, the most important part of this whole setup, the case. Now, I initially intended to put this in a standard MATX case. You might notice the problem, or the flaw in my plans there, my logic. This is a full ATX motherboard, and I had an MATX case in mind. What the hell's going on? Well, the case I bought for £20 British, but don't worry, I was going to offset the cost because it came with a PC in it that I was going to sell. I'm not anymore. The case I was going to use, I was hoping it was one of those cases where the power supply is below the motherboard. Because if the power supply is below the motherboard, what you can do is take the power supply out and have your motherboard overhang that section of the case. It's actually a pretty stable and sensible thing to do if your motherboard's too big for the MATX case you want to use. And then you just put the power supply somewhere else. You know, just find some screw holes that line up. Put the power supply any way you can. It doesn't really matter where the power supply goes. It doesn't have any moving components. You just need to make sure it's not touching anything that you don't want it to touch. You know, the traces on the motherboard or the back of a hard drive. You just don't want it rubbing up against anything sensitive. Now, unfortunately, the case that arrived had the power supply above the motherboard, which put a serious wrench in all my plans. In fact, here's footage of it putting the wrench in my plans. So, there's that. But this case here, the one that I've been leaning on so far in this video, this is a 3U server chassis that I got off someone on Reddit for free. I reached out to the Reddit page from my local area and asked if anyone had a PC case lying around. I had 2 replies. One person wasn't going to be available until November, and the other person had this. A 3U full ATX compatible server chassis. Complete with handles. I like these handles. We're not going to be using these handles. In fact, I'm going to be removing them from the case for the sake of this video. But this case is perfect for what I want to do in today's video. In fact, it couldn't be better. So, Now that I have explained the backstory to all of these parts, and shown you some of them, how about we actually build the PC, boot into Windows 11, launch some games, run some benchmarks, and see exactly what a £41 British PC can do in 2025. Okay, now for the exciting part, actually building the PC. I have already run preliminary tests on everything. I know that everything works. I know roughly how it performs, but I haven't actually put it all together in a case and, used it as a PC yet. I've really just been throwing a few stress tests at it to make sure it doesn't crash. Look at how nice this case is, by the way. It even has front panel USB 3, wherever the hell that just went. Yeah, front panel USB 3. Sadly, despite the fact that this motherboard supports USB 3, it doesn't support front panel USB 3. This is the cut down version. They removed the front panel header. That's what made it cut down. They removed the front panel header. And also all of the VRM cooling. Thank you, Asus. Anyway, let's clear some space, because I did kind of just throw everything on here all at once for the sake of the intro. And not that we need them, but included in the initial box of components were a bunch of fans. 3 120mm and a 140mm. I won't be able to use any of these in here because this has 80mm fans in the front and 60mm in the back. Hardly call this a server chassis with that limited airflow, but we do have fans. Fans were included. It also included a bunch of modular PSU cables that I couldn't identify, so they're not safe to use. They are literally just a fire hazard. It also came with a bunch of SATA cables, which is useful because I didn't budget SATA cables, and the HDMI cable came with the TV. So, that's nice. We're going to have to find a pretty... we're going to have to find somewhere to put the SSD and the hard drive. Now, to anyone giving away SkyQ HD boxes, just keep in mind that depending on how you left your Sky contract, Sky might want those back, and you can get into some debt with Sky if you don't give them back. This is our motherboard, an Asus P8Z67-VLX. It's a fairly high-end motherboard from 2010, I think, unless this is a 2011 model. The point is, this motherboard is one of the higher-end socket 1155 boards that you could have bought back in the day. It does have, as I said, a 2500K in it right now, but it does sadly have this really wimpy Intel stock cooler that Intel shipped in way too many of their CPU boxes. If, for instance, you were the person who had bought all these parts and you were dealing with it right now, replace this cooler. Anyway, this is a very basic motherboard mount that I 3D printed. It's just to keep things far enough off the desk that your GPU can mount safely and securely. Otherwise, the little pegs at the bottom of the PCIe bracket stick out, and it can be difficult to line it up in the PCIe slot. Okay, we have an extra standoff here that we do not want to deal with. Line that up. And there we go. Motherboard in the case. Now that the motherboard's in the case, you can see how the power supply is going to block front I/O connectivity and these PCI slots. But thankfully, it's not going to block any of the PCIe slots. So if you wanted to add in a PCIe, I don't know, Wi-Fi card or more USB 3, that'd be easily doable in this case. Okay, motherboard, front panel, that's all good. Let's put the 1060 in. We need to remove a few of these rear I/O shields. Oh, those are healthy sounds. Yeah, those are healthy sounds. We don't need to worry about that. Right, with the front panel covers in, we actually don't need to worry about them falling out anymore. They were falling out as I was carrying this thing home, and I was wondering why. They didn't have any screws in them. Okay, that took a minute, but we do now have a DVD drive. with space above it for our hard drive and SSD. Okay, now for SATA cables and all the other good stuff, and then I think we'll be ready for the power supply and the first power on test. So these are all SATA 6 gigabit ports, thank God. So it doesn't really matter where I plug these in. The reason I say thank God is LG1155 is a socket that was used for 2nd and 3rd gen Intel CPUs. The 2nd gen side only supported PCIe 2.0, and you were lucky if you got USB 3 or SATA 6 gigabit. And the 3rd gen side, it was motherboard dependent if you got PCIe 3.0, but they did support it. There was more adoption of USB 3 on those motherboards, but it was still hit or miss whether or not all of your SATA ports would be 6 gigabit. Then again, back in 2010, 2011, hard drives were what everyone was using, and 6 gigabit per second, you're not saturating that on a hard drive. And now for power supply. I will be mounting this with the fan on the bottom so that it can pull in air and blow it out. I mean, if I did it on the top, it would still be pulling in air and blowing it out because there's a small gap between the top panel and the power supply. But I would be choking it if I did it that way. So let's start by plugging everything in. Yeah, I'm not getting the cover. I'm not getting the side panel back on, am I? This will just have to be an open air computer, I guess. This should have been a 4U case. I needed a 4U case. Oh god, 8-pin CPU, because the power supply, why? Life, don't do this, what is stopping me? What is stopping me right now? Oh my god. There's a screw in the power supply, that's why it doesn't want to line up. There is a screw in the... Why is there a screw in the power supply? Okay, last thing we need to do... Realise there's a loose screw in here somewhere. Whoops. Is remove these handles. There we go. No more handles, no more server case. It is a bog standard PC case now. Looks fairly normal, I would say. You've got all your front I/O, you've got your 2 fans here, which really could have been... Like, this is just an 80mm. You could have put 90mm in here, maybe even 120s. I don't think you've got the spacing for 120s here. You'd have to remove this front I/O panel. But you could put larger fans in here. Definitely. Now, unfortunately, we're not getting the side panel on, are we? So you can see that this 6-pin connector comes out at the top of the GPU. So I would need a 4U, or a slightly larger server chassis in this case, in order to fit a GPU like that. However, the card itself fits in the case. What we need is for this 6-pin to be facing to the side of the GPU, toward the rest of the case. And there are plenty of graphics cards that have that 6-pin in that configuration. Or even an 8-pin, or a 12-pin. I don't know. Doesn't matter. Point is, this isn't one of those GPUs, so that's a sacrifice we have to make. We cannot put the side cover back on. Do not try this at home. You may very well end up blowing up your power supply. I'm only doing this because I can. They're in, but they're still too tall. They are still too tall. I don't know that that could be more perfect if I tried. Like, this is perfect. Okay. Not that easy to tell, but at the moment, we have managed to lower... If I just use this as an example, at the moment, we have managed to lower the power supply cable in line with the cooler itself. And I know this cooler already fits. So, don't do this at home. I'm going to say that again. Do not do this at home. Please do not remove the pins from a 6-pin connector and then halve them and then force them into a GPU. I don't care if you got the pin out right. It's not safe. I am doing this because I still have a second 6-pin if I need to use it. I am only doing this because I can afford to mess up. If you have a power supply at home that you think you're going to do this to, don't. Moment of truth. Does this fit? Yes. Look at that. Hold on. Yeah, we're going to have a slight bulge, and the side panel is going to keep the connector in place, which good, because we don't actually have anything else holding it in place. But it's on. It's on. It's on! Okay, where are the screws for the side panel? The TV won't turn on. Oh, the batteries in the remote are probably dead. Oh no. Come on, TV. Yes! Yes! Yeah, this remote needs new batteries, and batteries are not in the budget. Overclocking failed. We didn't have an overclock. I never set up an overclock on this thing. I don't know what it's talking about. Yeah, power fan, 4,500 RPM. Do we not have power fan control? No. So I would need to change that header to chassis fan. Yeah, okay. Hold on. There we go. Chassis fan is connected and they're running at... Well, at least it's not 4,500. They're running at 3,500 RPM. And surprisingly quieter now. Is our sound working? That's a good question. What's the volume set to? Oh, it's all the way down. That's a problem. Right. 3D Mark. Let's run a few 1080p tests, shall we? Let's do good old Firestrike. This should be able to handle Firestrike just fine. I mean, Firestrike was a GPU benchmark released in what, 2012, 2013? I think that's about as old as it is. And depending on how you count it, this PC is from about 2010. So, we're getting anywhere between 50 and 70 FPS, by the way. I am sad to say that now the PC has had a chance to warm up, this has definitely come from a smoker's home, because all of the staining and tobacco stuff that's going to be stuck to the inside of this case, it's warmed up and it's atomized, it's in the air, I can smell it. That's annoying. What's more annoying is the screen door effect on this recording right now. I don't know that I can fix that. It is very strange to me to see this part of the benchmark running smoothly. Reason being, when the Firestrike benchmark first came out and it was relevant, I would have been running this on my first gaming PC with a 2nd gen i3 and a HD 620. That benchmark ran at about 4 FPS. Okay, we got a score of 10,221, and there's Driver Booster trying to get my attention. A graphics score of 13,818 and a physics score of 6,533. 3D Mark is estimating that Battlefield 5 1440p Ultra settings should run at about 45 FPS. Interesting. Now, we did score above the average for this hardware, but I imagine we're nowhere near the best. No, we're about 1,000 points off of the best possible score, and that's going to be because our CPU isn't overclocked, which is a limitation of the cooler that we have, not the motherboard. If we had a better cooler, I would be able to overclock the CPU, Or if we went and bought the 3570K, which you can get for £8 British, that again would be a much better option than this CPU, because this CPU, it's going to get pegged at 100% usage in certain games. This CPU is going to hold us back. But hopefully, 1080p on a 1060 is going to alleviate the CPU bottleneck just enough, because we'll be GPU bound. So that was Firestrike. What about Time Spy? This will stress the GPU a lot more than the CPU, I'm hoping. So let's see what happens here. Okay, about 25 to 26 FPS. Definitely GPU bound. The GPU is drawing about 130 to 140 watts. And it's only at 60 degrees Celsius. So far. Obviously it's going to warm up. And that is a very healthy 3D Mark Time Spy score of 3,922. In fact, that's not even as good as it could have been if we had overclocked that CPU, because look at that graphics score. 4,276? We are being heavily bogged down by our CPU in that test. Now, I really need to fix my camera settings because recording this TV looks like crap. Next up, just for a bit of fun, why don't we run Unigine Valley benchmark? We're going to run this at 1080p, we're going to run this at ultra settings, and we're going to run this with 8x MSAA. Just what can this GPU do with a max settings 1080p benchmark? The sound's on, of course it is. At least the speakers work. And go. This is at max settings for this benchmark, and this benchmark came out in 2013. We're getting between 60 and 100 frames per second. Between 60 and 100. And there we have it. Unigine Valley running at the Extreme HD preset, which is basically 1080p absolutely cranked. We got an average FPS of 69.2 with a max of 141.7. Oh, unfortunately our minimum FPS did go down to 29, so might not be the smoothest experience, but it ran. It thinks we're on Windows 8 as well. Okay, so the last synthetic benchmark I'm going to run is Cinebench R15. Don't worry, everything after this will be games. 494. That's a little bit better than I was expecting. Just a hair under 500. A bit of overclocking, you might be able to get it to 600, but 494 is about what I would expect for an i5 2500K. Damn. For a game that's almost 13 years old, it still looks really good. I mean, sure, the lighting engine is baked in, none of the shadows are real time, but still, none of the shadows or the lighting is dynamic, but this really does look good. The hair is clipping through her neck. That's a bit unnatural. We're getting 120 FPS. Thankfully, this is one of those games that really doesn't care what CPU you're using. So you will always be GPU limited in this game, unless you're running like a Pentium. Unless you are running like a dual-core Pentium from 2008, I don't think you're going to have an issue playing this game. Average of 105.2. A min of 68 and a max of 134. Yeah, you could just play this at 1440p with this hardware. This game does not care. Just play it at 1440p, the game doesn't care. Next up in the gaming benchmarks, and hi, I'm recording this voiceover afresh, by the way,
The noise this PC was making in the background was getting a bit unbearable. We have the legendary Clair Obscur Expedition 33. This game has some pretty hefty hardware requirements, I'm not gonna lie. I did try and get the game working at native 1080p, but even with the lowest possible settings the game allowed, it wasn't possible. I moved over to XeSS, which is the only upscaling tech this system apparently supports, and still, I couldn't get the game above 25 FPS. So I turned to performance mods and a few INI file tweaks. Thanks to the definitive performance mod that you can download on the Nexus page for this game, I was able to increase the quality preset to medium, and also increase the level of XeSS to the quality preset, netting us an average frame rate of 43.9 with 1% lows of 5.2 and 0.1% lows of 1.8. I was pleasantly surprised when I booted up Resident Evil 4 on this machine. Not only was I able to get this game running at 1080p native without any file tweaks or performance mods, but I was also able to do it on not even the lowest quality preset this game has to offer. This is running on the Prioritize Performance preset. There is one step below that. and there are several steps above it, and given that we got an average FPS of 62.4 and a 1% low of 20.4, a 0.1% low of 7, yeah, it was a bit stuttery. I don't know if that was the hard drive I was booting the game off of or the CPU, but Resident Evil 4 had performance on the table. I could probably have upped the settings a little bit more, targeting 40 FPS rather than 60, but this was a very playable experience. Next up, we have the Dead Space remake, a 2023 title with a notorious history of being difficult to run. However, without needing to stoop too low, I was able to get this game running at 1080p low preset with FSR set to quality, netting us an average frame rate of 39.5 with 1% lows of 17.4 and 0.1% lows of 7.5. You might see a theme here, and that theme is stuttering. And just to mix things up a little bit, I figured I'd benchmark one of my favourite games from the past 10 years, Solstice, a hack and slash Devil May Cry inspired action game, very story focused, very visually appealing, and a game that I actually have a deep personal history with, because for 3 years running I was the world record speedrun holder for this game. Unfortunately, I'm not anymore due to some YouTube issues and hackers, and the videos don't exist anymore. Point is, we were able to get some amazing frame rates at pretty high quality here. Playing at 1080p native res with the high preset with motion blur off, we got 55.6 FPS on average, a 1% low of 6.2, and a 0.1% low of 1.6. It just seems we can't avoid stuttering no matter what I try. Next up is Dark Souls 3, and even with the settings absolutely maxed, this game has a 60 FPS frame cap, and we did not drop below it. At all. We got 60 FPS on average. 0.1% lows were still pretty low though, because unfortunately, this CPU stutters. Ooh, okay, that was not exactly the outcome I was envisioning when I went to fight that boss. Little bit rusty at Dark Souls 3. Little bit rusty at all the games I've tested today, to be honest. But there is one last test that I have to run on any PC I feature on this channel, and that is 4K 60 FPS YouTube.
Yeah, 4K 60, no drop frames. I finally built a computer that can actually handle 4K 60 YouTube. That's only funny if you've been watching the channel for a while. I've been struggling to get a PC to actually play 60 FPS 4K footage from YouTube for a while. So there we have it, a complete gaming PC and gaming setup for 41 British pounds, roughly 55 US dollars. Is it perfect? No. Would it be enjoyable to use if this was the only machine I had on hand? Probably not, because of the hitching and stuttering in games and applications. I imagine a lot of that is being caused by the CPU, and that wouldn't be the most impossible thing to upgrade. It wouldn't be the most difficult thing to upgrade, I meant to say, because a 3570K can be had for less than $10 in the UK. And if you're lucky in an eBay auction, you might even get yourself a 3rd Gen i7. But they're not the cheapest processors, sadly. But in terms of performance, this machine is astoundingly efficient in terms of price to performance. I paid 41 British pounds to put all of this together, and it plays modern titles at 1080p pretty well, actually. Yeah, okay, you might need to tweak a few more settings. Clair Obscur, I had to use a mod to get that to actually work at 1080p. Clair Obscur is a very demanding game visually, so it makes sense that I would have to use Performance mod to make that work. But Dead Space 2023 works at 1080p, low settings with FSR quality. Resident Evil 4 works about the same. Solstice works at high settings native. Like, this machine can play 1080p games pretty well. It is at the low end of 1080p gaming in 2025, but low end doesn't mean unplayable. It just means you might need to lower settings a bit more than you otherwise would have liked to in order to get games to play, but they play. So to recap, we have an i5 2500K on a Z68 motherboard with a GTX 1060 3GB GPU, 16 gigs of DDR3 1600, a 120GB SSD boot drive with a 1TB 2.5-inch hard drive. All of it contained within this 3U server chassis that I got for free, and all of it hooked up to this 32-inch 1080p LG TV that I also got for free. This is by far the best performing budget PC I think I've ever put together. And the thing is, that's not even the limit of what you could do within the budget. The budget I set myself, roughly 40 British pounds. I went over by 99 pence, big deal. That budget is a bit flexible. when you consider that, as I said earlier in the video, you could sell the HD 6850 that I have left over. That's £3 right there. And I have a PS4 that just needs a new hard drive. You could sell that for £25, more or less. Using that money, you could get a more modern, an i5 3570K to go in this motherboard, a better cooler, and perhaps even a larger boot SSD to allow you to install some more games on the SSD. Because right now, with a 120GB SSD, 40 gigs of that's already taken up by Windows. There's room for one game at a time on this SSD. It's really not enough. Now, other things that would need working on if this were to be my daily driver PC, the noise. These 80mm fans are being controlled by a PWM profile that I have no control over. So I would need to get either an external PWM controller, which aren't that expensive, or a low noise adapter for the actual fan header, which would artificially reduce the RPMs by lowering the voltage available to the fans. I do have some of those, but that's not included in the budget here. But this is an overclockable motherboard. There's no VRM cooling, so I'd probably recommend getting some adhesive-backed copper heatsinks to put on the VRM chips just to be safe. But we do have a 450 watt power supply here. It's only using 150 watts to the GPU and currently 75 to the CPU. I think it would be perfectly safe to overclock this CPU to around 4.5 GHz if you had a suitable cooler for it, because it really would benefit from an overclock, this system. It's being held back by that CPU. I wasn't expecting the CPU to be the limiting factor on this system. At 1080p gaming, I thought that GTX 1060 was going to be more of a bottleneck. But really, the 1060 is performing well on average, but frame-to-frame timing, frame pacing, is really important to how enjoyable a PC is to game on. And this CPU just can't keep up. So, if either the budget went up to £60, or, as I said, sell the GPU and the PS4, and you had the money, the CPU is a definite upgrade. The SSD maybe as well. But the GPU, that would do you for a few months to a year at most, as we go into 2026 and even more demanding titles keep coming out. I can't test Battlefield 6 on this as much as I would like to. I just don't have the time. That's a very big download, and it would really need to be on an SSD. But I would expect this to be able to play Battlefield 6 1080p low. I mean, it should be able to. It meets the minimum requirements. So, what do you think? Is there anything you would have changed? Anything you would have recommended I do instead? Any games you think I should have benchmarked, even though I'm not going to reply to any of those messages? Leave a comment down below, and if you have any interest in PCs like this in the future, maybe subscribe and stick around. I have some plans. Regardless, thank you very much for all the support I've been getting in my YouTube shorts with regards to this gaming setup, and thank you very much for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.